There are some voices that do not simply entertain you. They move into your life. They sit in the back seat on long drives. They echo through wedding halls, through old radios, through stadiums full of strangers suddenly singing like family. And for millions of people, Neil Diamond was never just a singer. He was a feeling. He was memory itself. For decades, he stood under the lights like a man untouched by time. The voice was full, the smile was steady, and the songs felt bigger than the room around them. Sweet Caroline was not just a hit, it became ritual. America was not just performance, it became emotion. Neil Diamond built the kind of career that makes people assume legends are immune to decline. But legends are still human. And sometimes, the cruelest part of aging is not the pain the world can see. It is the quiet subtraction. The things that disappear one by one. The ease, the rhythm, the body that once obeyed without hesitation. The certainty that tomorrow will look enough like yesterday to feel safe. In January 2018, Neil Diamond announced that he was retiring from concert touring after a Parkinson's diagnosis. His official statement said the disease had made large-scale travel and performing difficult, though he also made clear he intended to keep writing, recording, and pursuing new projects. The announcement came just before his 77th birthday and forced the cancellation of tour dates in Australia and New Zealand. And that is where the heartbreak begins. Because for most people, retirement means rest. For a performer like Neil Diamond, retirement can sound a lot like exile. The stage is not merely a workplace for a man like that. It is identity. It is proof of life. It is where applause covers fear. It is where aging can be outrun for 2 hours under perfect light. To lose touring is not only to lose motion. It is to lose the sacred ritual that told both artist and audience that everything was still okay. Imagine being a man who spent half a century turning emotion into sound, then being told the body that carried that sound across the world could no longer be trusted in the same way. Not gone, not silent, but changed. And changed is sometimes harder to accept than finished. Later that year, Diamond said he was staying active, taking medication, working out, and still had his voice, even though he could no longer handle the traveling the way he once had. He also said he wanted to stay productive and keep making music. That may sound hopeful on paper, but beneath it is a devastating truth. The passion remained, yet the old way of living that passion had been broken. That is the part people rarely understand about icons in their later years. The world sees a diagnosis. The artist feels a rearranged existence. Because Parkinson's does not just challenge movement, it challenges confidence, timing, endurance, public exposure. And when your entire legacy has been built on walking into a sea of people and commanding the room with total control, any condition that introduces uncertainty is not just medical, it is existential. For younger stars, reinvention is often fashionable. For older legends, reinvention can feel like grief wearing makeup. Neil Diamond did not vanish. That almost makes the story sadder. He remained present enough for the world to remember what was there, but changed enough for everyone to feel what had been lost. In 2022, he made a surprise appearance at the Broadway opening of A Beautiful Noise, the musical based on his life, and performed Sweet Caroline. It was moving not because he looked like the Neil Diamond of the 1970s, but because he didn't. It was a reminder that time had passed, that the man was still here, and that survival itself had become part of the performance. And maybe that is what makes Neil Diamond's reality at 85 so difficult to watch. Not scandal, not disgrace, not collapse, but fragility. The fragility of seeing a man once associated with sheer musical force, now framed by limitation. The fragility of hearing a familiar voice and realizing it carries not just melody now, but history. The fragility of knowing that the songs still live with full strength in millions of hearts, while the body that first delivered them must negotiate every step with more care than before. Yet, there is something almost unbearably beautiful in that too, because while touring ended, the story did not. Diamond's official site is still active in 2026, promoting the archival release Wild at Heart, and A Beautiful Noise is continuing on stage, including an Australian production opening in Melbourne in August 2026. His public life is no longer about conquering arenas night after night. It is about endurance, legacy, and the strange, haunting dignity of being remembered while still alive enough to witness it. That may be the most emotional chapter of all, to spend a lifetime becoming unforgettable, and then live long enough to watch your own legend continue moving without you in the way it once did. Neil Diamond is still here, still revered, still woven into the emotional soundtrack of several generations. But that does not erase the sorrow. In some ways, it deepens it, because what happened to him was not one explosive tragedy. It was something slower, quieter, and more intimate. A man whose songs once filled arenas, now teaching the world a final lesson from the shadows. That even when the spotlight dims, the ache remains, the memory remains, and sometimes the bravest thing a legend can do is stay. Long before the diagnosis, long before the farewell to touring, Neil Diamond was already writing like a man who understood loneliness better than most people ever would. That is what makes his story hurt in a deeper way, because the public remembers the roar, the crowds, the standing ovations, the sing-alongs so loud they almost swallowed him whole. But underneath all of that was a songwriter who kept returning to the same emotional territory again and again. Distance, longing, identity, restlessness, the ache of being seen by millions and still feeling somehow alone. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame describes songwriting as Diamond's way of finding his true nature. And even a quick look at his catalog shows how often he turned private confusion into public anthem. That is the contradiction at the center of Neil Diamond. He did not become immortal by sounding invincible. He became immortal by sounding wounded in a way people could sing with. Before he was the man of arena-sized choruses, he was already proving he could write directly into the bloodstream of popular culture. Britannica notes that after signing with Bang Records in 1965, he released his debut album in 1966 and soon wrote I'm a Believer, the song that became a major hit for the Monkees. Then came the run of songs that turned Neil Diamond from a successful songwriter into a cultural force. Sweet Caroline, Cracklin' Rosie, I Am, I Said, and Song Sung Blue. And that is where the tragedy becomes almost poetic, because songs like those sound enormous. But the emotions inside them are intimate, almost claustrophobic. A man can stand in front of 20,000 people and still be wrestling with the same private emptiness he had in a much smaller room years earlier. Fame does not erase that. Sometimes it amplifies it. Sometimes it traps a person inside a public version of himself so successful that nobody notices the private one slowly disappearing behind it. Listen closely to Neil Diamond's career, and you can almost hear two lives happening at once. In one life, he is a giant. A best-selling recording artist, a hitmaker, a performer with a catalog so durable that generations who never lived through his peak still know the chorus to Sweet Caroline. He was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1984 and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2011. The kind of honors that confirm a career has moved beyond popularity and into permanence. But in the other life, he is still searching, still trying to locate himself inside the voice, still using songs not just to entertain, but to explain something to himself. That is why I Am, I Said matters so much in his story. It was a major hit in both the United States and the United Kingdom. But what lingers is not just its success. It is the fact that even in the middle of triumph, Neil Diamond was writing from a place of spiritual displacement. The song has long been associated with some of his most personal writing, And Rock Hall's portrait of him as an artist who used songwriting to find himself makes that track feel less like a performance and more like a confession. And maybe that is why aging hit this story with such unusual force. Because when a performer built his entire identity on expression, any threat to expression feels catastrophic, not merely professional, personal. When Neil Diamond announced in January 2018 that he was retiring from concert touring because Parkinson's disease had made travel and large-scale performance difficult, the public heard the practical reality. Tours canceled, stages gone quiet, another legend stepping back. But the emotional reality was harsher than the logistics. A man who had spent decades turning inner feeling into living sound was suddenly being told that the body itself had become part of the obstacle. And even then, acceptance did not come quickly. In a 2023 CBS interview, Diamond said he was only just beginning to come to terms with the diagnosis years after first receiving it in 2018. Reports on that interview noted that he had been in denial for a period after learning the news. That detail is devastating because it strips away the myth of the serene legend gracefully accepting fate. It reveals something far more human: shock, resistance, disbelief, and the stubborn instinct to keep working as if sheer willpower might overrule reality. That may be the most painful image of Neil Diamond at 85. Not a fallen star, not a disgraced man, not some sensational collapse, but an artist who gave the world songs of certainty while privately living through uncertainty. An artist whose music made other people feel less alone, while his own later years forced him into a more fragile relationship with the very thing that defined him. And yet, somehow, he still remains present. His official site is active in 2026, and it is currently promoting Wild at Heart, a new archival release arriving on the 8th of May, 2026. That detail matters because it shows the story has not ended in silence. The touring life ended, yes. The old rhythm ended. But the work, the archive, the legacy, the voice recorded in time, those things keep moving forward. Maybe that is why Neil Diamond's story is so hard to watch and so hard to turn away from. Because it is not really about celebrity. It is about what happens when a man spends a lifetime pouring himself into songs, only to reach an age where memory grows stronger than motion, where legacy becomes louder than the present moment, and where survival itself starts to look like its own final performance. Neil Diamond once gave people choruses they could shout with joy. Now his life gives them something quieter, something sadder, something closer to truth. That even the strongest voices do not escape time. They simply learn, one painful note at a time, how to echo inside it. What makes Neil Diamond's story so devastating is that his pain never arrived in the loud, theatrical way people expect from Hollywood tragedy. There was no single explosion, no public meltdown, no disgrace so spectacular that the world could point to one date and say, that was the day everything ended. Instead, his story became sad in the way real life so often becomes sad. Gradually, quietly, almost politely. And that kind of heartbreak is sometimes the hardest to process, because there is nothing dramatic enough to shield us from its truth. We cannot dismiss it as scandal. We cannot reduce it to gossip. We are forced to look at something much more uncomfortable. A man growing older, a body changing, a legend becoming fragile right in front of us. For decades, Neil Diamond represented stamina. His songs were built for endurance. His voice was never delicate in the traditional sense. It had weight, grain, force. It sounded lived in. It sounded like it had already survived things before it ever reached the microphone. That was part of why audiences trusted him. He never sounded manufactured. He sounded human, but stronger than most humans. And that illusion matters, because every star is sustained not only by talent, but by the image people attach to that talent. In Neil Diamond's case, the image was solidity, presence, command. The feeling that no matter how much time passed, he would still be standing there somewhere under the lights, shoulders squared, voice rising, giving the crowd exactly what they came for. Then time did what time always does. It collected its debt. And suddenly, the image of permanence became something painfully temporary. That is when fans begin to grieve in a strange, confusing way. They are not grieving a death. Not exactly. They are grieving a version of someone. The version that seemed untouchable. The version that belonged to youth or peak power, or the years when music still felt capable of freezing the world in place for 3 perfect minutes. When people see Neil Diamond now, that is part of what breaks them. They are not just seeing the man in front of them, they are seeing every earlier version at once. The hungry writer, the hitmaker, the arena giant, the cultural symbol. And against all of those memories stands the simple truth of age. A truth no applause can reverse. There is something deeply haunting about an artist outliving his own mythology. Most people never have to experience that. Their private self and public self remain more or less the same size. But for a legendary performer, the public self becomes enormous, almost impossible to carry. It follows him everywhere. It sits beside him in interviews. It shadows every appearance. It turns every small moment into a comparison with a larger past. And comparison is merciless. That is why even the most moving later appearances by aging legends often carry sadness with them. The audience is happy to see them, grateful even. But gratitude can contain grief. Love can contain grief. Nostalgia almost always does. When a crowd rises for a man like Neil Diamond, they are not only celebrating survival, they are also silently acknowledging loss. Loss of time, loss of ease, loss of the body that once carried the music so effortlessly. But maybe the cruelest part is this: the songs do not age the way people do. Sweet Caroline can still erupt in a room and make strangers feel united within seconds. The old recordings still carry that same confidence, that same lift, that same electric sense that the voice knows exactly where it is going. Music preserves a person at certain emotional temperatures forever. It can keep them warm long after life has forced them into colder seasons. So the audience hears the old Neil Diamond and remembers power. Then they see the present Neil Diamond and confront vulnerability. And the distance between those two images becomes almost unbearable. Yet there is dignity in that distance too, because not every artist gets to witness the full weight of what they meant to people. Not every legend survives long enough to watch the world keep singing the songs back to him. Neil Diamond has lived long enough to become something more than a performer. He has become memory itself for millions of people. Birthdays, weddings, road trips, sports crowds, family parties, lonely nights, all of it carrying some trace of his voice. That should feel triumphant. And, in a way, it is. But triumph in old age can still be heartbreaking, because by then, it no longer looks like conquest. It looks like endurance. It looks like adaptation. It looks like a man learning to live beside the ruins of his former certainty. That is why his story hits so hard. Because Neil Diamond does not remind people only of fame. He reminds them of what happens to all human strength in the end. It changes form. It softens. It slows. It asks to be measured differently. And perhaps the saddest thing of all is that many people do not know how to honor that quieter kind of strength. They know how to celebrate peak years. They know how to worship success. But they do not always know how to sit with the sight of a legend who is still here, still loved, and yet undeniably touched by time. So they say, try not to cry. But the tears are not really about pity. They are about recognition. Recognition that the voice that once carried whole arenas now carries history. Recognition that the man who once seemed larger than life is, in the end, subject to the same passage of time as everyone else. Recognition that even icons do not defeat mortality. They simply teach us, more beautifully than most, how to face it. There is a moment in every great career when applause stops being proof of power and starts becoming proof of memory. That is the stage Neil Diamond has reached. And maybe that is why his story feels less like ordinary celebrity aging and more like something almost sacred. Because when a man has spent decades soundtracking other people's lives, his decline does not feel private. It feels collective. People are not just watching Neil Diamond grow older, they are watching a piece of their own past grow older with him. That is what makes it so emotional. For one generation, he was the sound of youth. For another, he was the sound of home. For another, he became the sound of nostalgia itself. And all of those meanings now rest on the shoulders of one aging man who never asked to become a symbol, only to sing. But symbols pay a special price. The world does not let them age normally. An ordinary person can become frail in peace. An icon becomes frail in public memory. Every photograph is compared to an older one. Every appearance is measured against a vanished peak. Every smile carries the burden of reassuring strangers that things are not as sad as they look. That is exhausting even to imagine. Because what does the world really want from a legend in his later years? It says it wants authenticity. It says it wants honesty. It says it wants to celebrate the full journey. But often what it truly wants is a miracle. It wants the old magic preserved without visible cost. It wants the voice without the tremor, the smile without the fatigue, the legend without the evidence of time. And when time does show itself, people call the moment heartbreaking, not because the artist has failed them, but because reality finally has. Neil Diamond never built his legacy on being fashionable. That is part of why he lasted. He was not one of those stars whose fame depended on novelty alone. He belonged to something deeper, emotional permanence. His songs attached themselves to the parts of life people revisit over and over. Longing, belonging, regret, devotion, hope. That kind of music survives trends because it is stitched into human repetition. People keep coming back to it because life keeps bringing them back to the same feelings, which means his voice did something rare. It outlived the era that created it. And that should be comforting. Yet even that carries sorrow, because once an artist becomes timeless, the contrast with his mortal body becomes sharper. The songs remain available at full strength. The man does not. The recordings stay fixed in their prime. The artist must keep moving through years they never had to face. That is a lonely kind of immortality. To know that the version of you most people carry in their hearts is younger, stronger, louder, less burdened than the person you have become. Imagine living with that split every day. Imagine knowing that somewhere, in millions of homes and cars and playlists, there exists a Neil Diamond who can still fill an arena without effort. A Neil Diamond who never tires, never shakes, never slows, never needs to negotiate with time. Meanwhile, the real man wakes up inside an older body, a quieter routine, and a life no longer arranged around the certainty of the stage. That is not failure, but it is loss. And loss does not have to be sensational to be profound. Sometimes the saddest losses are the ones that leave everything technically intact. The name remains, the songs remain, the love remains, the public reverence remains, yet something essential has shifted, and no one can shift it back. The old velocity is gone. The old ease is gone. The old illusion of endlessness is gone. What remains is truth. And truth, in stories like this, can be almost too intimate to look at directly. Because Neil Diamond at 85 forces people to confront a reality they spend most of their lives avoiding. That the things which once made them feel invincible will not stay frozen forever. Their heroes will age, their parents will age, their own reflections will age. Even the songs that once felt like escape will one day begin to sound like memory. That is why his story opens a wound in people. It is not only about him, it is about the terrifying tenderness of watching strength become gentleness. Watching certainty become acceptance. Watching a man once defined by performance enter a chapter where simply being present carries more emotional weight than any encore ever could. And maybe that is the hidden grandeur of Neil Diamond's final era. Not that he escaped suffering, not that he stayed untouched, not that he defeated time, but that he remained recognizable through it. The soul in the songs still feels the same. The emotional honesty still feels the same. The humanity still feels the same. The body changed. The public role changed. The scale of life changed. But somewhere beneath all of that, the same man still seems to be there. The one who always understood that people do not need perfection from music. They need truth. They need feeling. They need a voice that tells them their private ache belongs to the world too. That is what Neil Diamond gave them. And now, in this quieter, more fragile chapter, he gives them one last truth they never asked for, but perhaps needed most. That even a legend can tremble, even a legend can slow down, even a legend can lose part of the life he once knew, and still remain a legend. In the end, the saddest part of Neil Diamond's story may not be the diagnosis, the cancelled tours, or even the visible slowing of a once unstoppable life. It may be the silence that comes after a lifetime of being heard. Because people often misunderstand what happens to legendary performers in old age. They imagine rest, peace, relief. They assume that after decades of noise, an artist must welcome quiet like an old friend. But for someone like Neil Diamond, quiet is complicated. Quiet can heal. Quiet can protect. But quiet can also remind a man of everything that used to answer him back. The crowd. The band. The lights. The anticipation that rose before the first note. Those things do not simply disappear when a career changes. They remain in the body like phantom sensations. A person can stop touring, but the rhythm of touring does not instantly stop living inside him. The body remembers. The mind remembers. The heart remembers. And memory, at that age, becomes both gift and burden. That is why stories like Neil Diamond's feel so emotionally heavy. He is not only carrying the present, he is carrying decades of former selves. The young songwriter full of hunger, the emerging star learning how fast the world could open for him, the mature icon hearing thousands of strangers sing his words back to him as if they belonged to them too. All of those men still exist somewhere inside the older one. But only one of them gets to live in the present. And the present is quieter, more careful, more limited, more reflective. There is no cruelty quite like being forced to become a witness to your own legend. To watch the songs continue traveling without you in the same way. To see audiences still moved by a voice captured decades earlier. To feel the world's love arrive not always as energy, but sometimes as remembrance. Remembrance sounds beautiful, and often it is. But remembrance can also hurt, because it means a significant part of what people love most is behind you. They are not only loving who you are, they are loving who you were, what you represented, what your music preserved for them. That kind of love is real, but it can also be lonely, especially for a man whose greatest power was presence. Neil Diamond was never just background music. He was a rival. He was emotional force entering a room. He was the kind of artist who made people feel that something important was happening right now. And that is why his later years carry such haunting weight. The right now is no longer defined by a new tour, a massive stage, another triumphant run across continents. It is defined by endurance, by legacy, by carefully chosen appearances, by the fact of survival itself. That is noble, but it is also heartbreaking. Because survival is a much quieter form of greatness than triumph. It asks for different virtues, patience instead of momentum, acceptance instead of conquest, grace instead of force. And the world is not always good at honoring those virtues in men it once worshipped for power. It misses the old thunder. It hears the softer voice and calls it sad. It sees restraint and calls it decline. It forgets that there is courage in continuing at all. Neil Diamond's story, in that sense, is not merely the story of a singer growing old. It is the story of masculinity changing shape, of power becoming vulnerability without losing worth, of a public giant entering a deeply human chapter, of a man once measured by volume now being measured by resilience. And resilience is not glamorous. It does not come with confetti. It does not make headlines the way youth does. It does not thrill people the way reinvention or scandal does. Resilience is slower than that. It is waking up and adjusting. It is staying connected to the work in whatever form remains possible. It is allowing the world to see you altered and not disappearing entirely because of it. That may be one of the bravest things Neil Diamond ever did. Not the records, not the sold-out halls, not the songs that became eternal, but staying visible enough for people to understand that legends do not escape pain, they simply endure it in a more public light. And perhaps that is why people cry when they look at him now. Not because he is diminished beyond recognition, but because he is recognizable enough for the contrast to hurt, recognizable enough for the old songs to rush back all at once, recognizable enough to remind people that the distance between glory and fragility is not as wide as they once believed. At 85, Neil Diamond stands as something more moving than a pop icon. He stands as evidence. Evidence that success cannot stop time. That talent cannot bargain with the body forever. That even a life filled with standing ovations eventually arrives at quieter truths. But he is also evidence of something else. That beauty does not end when force ends. That meaning does not disappear when momentum disappears. That a man can lose the life he once knew and still remain deeply, unmistakably himself. And maybe that is the final ache in Neil Diamond's story. The world first loved him because he sounded larger than life. Now it cannot stop looking because he sounds and feels so profoundly human. And perhaps that is where the real heartbreak finally reveals itself. Not in what Neil Diamond lost, but in what he can no longer return to. There are some chapters in life that do not close with a door slam. They close with an echo, a fading sound, a room still standing exactly as it always was, except the person who once filled it can no longer enter in the same way. That is what makes the story of aging artists so devastating. The world they built does not vanish. It remains fully intact around them. The songs still play. The audience still remembers. The legacy still grows. But the body, the stamina, the old certainty, those do not always come along for the rest of the journey. So, the man remains. The myth remains. But the old life does not. That is a brutal thing to survive. Because how do you make peace with being loved, most fiercely, in a form you can no longer fully inhabit? How do you live with the knowledge that your younger self is still out there, everywhere, preserved in sound, preserved in memory, preserved in the emotional lives of strangers, while you must go on as an older, more fragile version of the same soul? For many people, that question is unbearable even in private life. For Neil Diamond, it became public. Every time an old performance resurfaces, every time a crowd erupts into one of his choruses, every time people speak of him with that mixture of joy and sorrow reserved for living legends, the same truth rises quietly beneath it all. They are not only celebrating him, they are grieving time. Their time. His time. The time when everything felt fuller, louder, stronger, more permanent than it really was. That is why his story lands with such force. Because it reminds people that what they loved in him was never just the music. It was the illusion attached to the music. The illusion that a voice like that could hold back age. The illusion that charisma could outlast decline. The illusion that some people, if they meant enough to us, might somehow be spared the ordinary humiliations of being human. But no one is spared. Not even the men whose songs once made whole arenas feel invincible. And yet, within that sorrow, there is also something strangely majestic. Because Neil Diamond's final chapter is not defined by disappearance, it is defined by transformation. The power is different now. It does not come from command. It comes from endurance. It does not come from dominating a stage. It comes from standing inside reality without the armor that performance once provided. That kind of presence is quieter, but in some ways, it is even more profound. Anyone can look powerful in their peak years. Anyone can appear larger than life when youth, fame, momentum, and applause are all moving in the same direction. But to remain emotionally significant after the body has changed, to remain beloved after the old image has cracked, to remain deeply moving not because you are untouched, but because you are visibly touched by time. That is another kind of greatness entirely. And maybe that is the truth hidden beneath all the sadness surrounding Neil Diamond at 85. He is no longer a symbol of escape. He is a symbol of survival. No longer the fantasy of endlessness, but the reality of endurance. No longer simply the man who sang people through their best memories, but the man who now teaches them how memory itself can ache. That is why people look at him and struggle not to cry. Because they are seeing more than an aging singer. They are seeing what becomes of beauty when strength fades, but meaning remains. They are seeing what becomes of fame when the spotlight grows gentler. They are seeing what becomes of a man when the world still loves him, but life no longer allows him to meet that love in the same way he once did. And there is no easy way to witness that. Only gratitude. Only sorrow. Only the strange, almost sacred tenderness that comes from watching someone remain precious while becoming fragile. In the end, Neil Diamond's story is not a warning. It is a mirror. A mirror held up to everyone who has ever loved a song so much that it became part of their identity. A mirror for anyone who has ever mistaken success for permanence. A mirror for anyone who still hopes that the things they cherish most might somehow remain untouched if they cherish them hard enough. But life does not work that way. Voices change, bodies slow, worlds shrink, legends age. And still, somehow, the soul keeps singing. That may be the most haunting part of all. Not that Neil Diamond could not stay the man he used to be, but that even after everything changed, you can still feel the same heart inside the music and inside the man. And sometimes, that is exactly what makes it impossible not to cry. In the end, the story of Neil Diamond does not fade out the way people expect. There is no dramatic final note, no perfect goodbye, no clean ending that allows the audience to stand up, applaud, and walk away feeling complete. Because real life rarely gives legends that kind of closure. Instead, it leaves something unfinished in the air. A feeling, a question, a quiet, lingering ache that stays long after the music stops. And maybe that is exactly how Neil Diamond's story was always meant to end. Not with certainty, but with emotion. Because if you strip away the fame, the awards, the sold-out arenas, what remains is something far more intimate. A man who spent his entire life trying to translate feeling into sound. A man who gave strangers the words they didn't know how to say. A man who stood in front of millions, night after night, and somehow made each person feel like the song belonged to them alone. That kind of connection does not disappear, even now, even at 85, even in a quieter, more fragile chapter. Somewhere, right now, a room full of people is still singing Sweet Caroline at the top of their lungs. Not because they are thinking about charts, or history, or legacy, but because the emotion still works. The lift still happens. The moment still feels alive. And that is the paradox of Neil Diamond. The man slowed down, but the feeling never did. The body changed, but the music did not. The life became smaller, but the impact only grew larger. That is not a tragedy in the traditional sense, but it is something just as powerful, because it forces us to confront a truth we spend most of our lives avoiding, that the things we create can outlive the way we once lived inside them. And there is beauty in that. But there is also pain, because it means letting go of control. Letting go of the version of yourself the world fell in love with. Letting go of the certainty that you will always be able to meet that love in the same way. For Neil Diamond, that letting go did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, piece by piece. A tour no longer possible, a performance more difficult, a realization that the life he built on stage would no longer be the center of his days. And yet, he did not disappear. That matters. He stayed. Stayed long enough for people to see the full arc. Stayed long enough for the illusion to fall away. Stayed long enough for the world to understand that behind every legend is a human being who must eventually face the same ending as everyone else. Not necessarily death, but change. And change is its own kind of ending, but also its own kind of truth. Because what Neil Diamond leaves behind is not just music. He leaves behind a lesson about what it means to matter. Not for a moment, not for a trend, not for a headline, but for a lifetime. And beyond it, he showed that greatness is not measured only by how high you rise, but by how deeply you are felt. Not by how long you dominate the stage, but by how long your voice continues to echo after you step away from it. At 85, Neil Diamond is no longer chasing anything. No more proving. No more conquering. No more racing against time. And maybe, in a way that is both beautiful and heartbreaking, that is the final transformation. From performer to memory. From voice to feeling. From legend to something even quieter, but somehow more lasting. A presence. The kind that does not need to stand under lights anymore to be seen. The kind that does not need to sing anymore to be heard. And that is why people struggle not to cry. Because they are not just saying goodbye to a man, they are saying goodbye to a version of time. A version of themselves. A version of the world that felt a little louder, a little warmer, a little more certain when his voice was at its peak. But even as that version fades, the music remains, the memory remains, the feeling remains. And somewhere, in that space between what was and what still is, Neil Diamond is still singing, just not in the way he used to. And maybe that is enough.